Hello, my name is Kareem Khalifa, and today we'll be talking about validity and truth tables. Here's how we'll proceed today. First, I'll explain why this matters. Second, I'll talk about how truth tables work. And third, I'll talk about how to work truth tables. That is, how to ascertain whether an argument is valid or invalid using truth tables. Speaking of valid arguments, here's just a quick reminder. An argument is valid if and only if there is no possible way for all of its premises to be true when its conclusion is false. I repeat, this is the single most important concept in the class. This is the single most important concept in the class. You with me? So why does this matter? Remember, I told you the core mission of this course is to figure out which arguments are valid and which arguments are invalid. Truth tables provide an algorithm, a mechanical procedure for testing for validity. Now, this might sound like there's no creativity required in using a truth table, and in a certain sense that's right. But on the other hand, you can't present anyone with a truth table. So what they do is they actually structure your creativity. They say, here's the kind of thing that will generate a counterexample that you can present to someone, and the creativity will come in reading the truth table and putting things back into English. So now let's talk about how truth tables work, and specifically how they work in the context of using them to evaluate the validity of an argument. Recall this very, very important concept of validity. An argument is valid if and only if there is no possible way for all of its premises to be true when its conclusion is false. Important. Remember, important. Next, recall where there's a row, there's a way. Stated a bit more precisely, truth tables specify all the different ways in which premises and conclusions can be true and false. So when we put these 2 points together, we end up with the following. An argument is valid if there is no row on a truth table in which all its premises are true and its conclusion is false. It's this third point that basically allows us to have this nice mechanical procedure for evaluating the validity of arguments using truth tables. Next, let's talk about how you can use truth tables, how you can harness their awesome power in order to evaluate the validity of arguments. I can't even say that with a straight face, man. So how do you use a truth table in order to ascertain the validity of an argument? I'm going to break this down into 5 steps. First, you set up guide columns, and you'll see this is exactly like what you did with the previous lesson. Next, you set up an additional column for every premise and for the conclusion. Then you mark these accordingly. Third, you're going to add more columns to interpret complex sentences, and you'll see that this is just like what we did with the previous lesson with complex sentences. For your fourth step, you're going to use your knowledge of the Boolean connectives. Right now that consists of negation, conjunction, and disjunction to fill out the table. Finally, you're in a position to read the truth table. And basically what you're doing is you're looking for a case where all of the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So you're going to look for a row, because where there's a row, there's a way, where all the P columns have T's underneath them, and the C column has an F underneath them. If that's the case, then you have an invalid argument. If you don't find any rows like that, then you have a valid argument. Let's begin with an example. Suppose I say Iron Man is green or the Hulk is green. Iron Man is not green. Therefore, the Hulk is green. We can see that as an instance of a broader pattern. A or B, not A, therefore B. This is basically just a kind of process of elimination. Crucially, I hope it's obvious that this argument is valid. Right? So we're going to show that our procedure works and verifies, in fact, that this is valid. Now let's walk through our 5 steps for testing for validity. The first step is basically identical to what we did in the previous lesson, except now we're not just looking at the atomic sentences in a single complex expression, but we're looking at the number of atomic sentences in the whole argument. So there's going to be multiple expressions. There may be complex sentences in both the premises and the conclusion, and multiple premises. Our example is a simple one. There's only 2 atomic sentences, and so that's all we have to put in here. And you'll see that I counted up the number of rows underneath using the math that we used in the previous lesson. Similarly, we put the truth values just as we did in the previous lesson as well. On the leftmost column, the top half are all true, the bottom half are all false. In the next column, the top quarter is true, the next quarter is false, the third quarter is true, and the last quarter is false. And then we're done because we have the true, false alternating accordingly. So it may seem that you haven't done anything very significant thus far, but in fact you have. You've presented all the possible ways in which to interpret the argument you're evaluating. Right? So if this thing is invalid, then one of those rows is going to show you that it is. Right? You basically are going to assign truth and falsity to your atomic propositions, your atomic sentences, and that will tell you whether or not this thing is valid or invalid. Okay, let's move to our second step. And this really sort of has two parts to it. First, you're going to set up an additional column for every premise and the conclusion. And you'll see that this is exactly what I've done here. Recall that A or B was one of our premises, and that's in that third column. And then in our fourth column, we have our second premise, which is not A. And it turns out in this case that our conclusion is just an atomic sentence. It's B. So we don't need to add an extra column for that. But in other cases, of course, we would, because we're not always going to have atomic sentences as our conclusions. Next, we're going to want to clearly mark which columns are the premises and which column is the conclusion. This is mostly for good bookkeeping purposes. Third step is we add more columns to interpret complex sentences. This looks a lot like what we did before. We just look for the logical connectives, right? Things like not and or, and we add an extra column there. Next, we're going to use those basic cooking techniques, as I've called them in previous lectures. That is, our knowledge of the basic Boolean connectives and, or, and not to complete the rest of the truth table. So obviously the easiest part of this is filling in the columns where there are already just A's and B's, because we know what those are from the guide columns. Then we can start to use our knowledge of the Boolean connectives to fill out the rest of this table. So for instance, we know that P1 is A or B, and we know that or statements are false only when both disjuncts are false and otherwise are true. So that means that only that bottom row is going to have an F under it and the rest will be true. And that's exactly what we see here. Similarly, we know that we're just going to flip the truth value whenever we have a negation. So we're just going to flip all of the cases where A is true to false and all the cases where A is false to true when we look at P2, which is not A. Okay, at this point you've filled out the entire truth table. Now you've got to read the thing in order to figure out whether the argument's valid or invalid. How do you do that? Well, you only focus on the P columns and the C column. What you're looking for is a single row in which all of the P columns have T's underneath them, and the C column has an F underneath it. And that tells you that there's some row in which all of the premises are true, and the conclusion is false. Where there's a row, there's a way. So it tells you that there's some way for all the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. And that's the definition of invalidity. So it follows from this that a valid argument is one in which you have none of these incriminating rows, if you want to call them. That is, rows in which all of the P columns have T's underneath them and the C column has an F underneath them. Right? And that's exactly what we see in this particular argument, which is good because we started off saying intuitively this seems like a valid argument. We've now proven that it is. In the previous example, we proved that the following was valid. A or B, not A, therefore B. Now let's look at a different one. This one's going to be invalid. This one goes A or B, A, therefore not B. Let me give you a very straightforward example that shows you that this is invalid. The following would be an instance of this new argument pattern we're looking at. Either Gomorrah is green or the Hulk is green. Gomorrah is green, therefore the Hulk is not green. Now obviously that's bad reasoning. You can see that because both of the premises are true and the conclusion is false. What we're going to do is show you that you can do this with the truth table too. Now I'm just going to go ahead and fast forward through the first three steps because hopefully at this point they're starting to feel a little familiar. Note that when we get to step 4, basically filling this out, and there's only minor tweaks from the previous example. So for instance, we notice that the premises and the conclusions are in different spots. So P2 is now over A because we've changed the structure of the argument. The conclusion is now not B, and so on and so forth. And then you can see that these basically are hopefully starting to feel a little familiar in terms of how you would fill out the rest of this. So here's the major difference between the previous example, which is a valid argument, and the current example, which is an invalid argument. The valid argument had no incriminating rows. That is, no rows in which all the premises were true and the conclusion was false. This one does have an incriminating row, and it's that first one. You look under the P columns and the C columns, and you see it matches up in just that way. So it's invalid. To wrap up, let me show you what I think of as a pretty convenient shortcut. Basically, you know that the only rows that you care about are the incriminating rows. That is, the rows in which all the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So right after you finish basically step 3 of your process, when you're about to fill out your table, you can start to ignore rows if you know that they're not incriminating. For instance, take a look at where we're at this stage in constructing our truth table. Since A is one of our premises, we know that any row in which A is false is not going to be an incriminating row, and so we can just ignore that. We don't have to bother filling it out, and that pretty much cuts our work in half. And you can keep on repeating this shortcut. For instance, let's take a look at that second row after we filled out the truth values for the conclusion, not B. We know that any row in which the conclusion is true is not going to be an incriminating row, and so we get to ignore that second row. We don't have to figure out the truth value of A or B for that second row. So we've saved ourselves a little bit of work there too. Now, you might ask yourself, why did I choose to go in just this order? One thing you want to do in order to make the most of these shortcuts is actually just look for the statements that are the easiest to determine, that just don't require a lot of calculation. So negations and simple statements are clearly the easiest that you have. And that's why I decided to do A first and then not B second. But of course, in an argument like this, nothing is terribly hard to calculate, so you don't really appreciate the full force of the shortcuts. But hopefully you're just starting to see just the percentage of rows I get to ignore is pretty substantial. Indeed, you see that I just end up only having to go through one row in this particular case from left to right in completion, and it's exactly the row that we identified as the incriminating row when we went through this without any of the shortcuts. All right, really quick recap. First, truth tables are just an awesome way of ascertaining which arguments are valid and which arguments are invalid. Not as awesome as proofs, but pretty awesome. Why are truth tables so awesome at ascertaining the validity of arguments? Basically because all you have to do is look for an incriminating row. You find one, the argument's invalid. You don't, it's valid.
Thanks, and I'll see you at the next lesson.